Hello and welcome back to Chillers and Thrillers. I am your host Em, and in this podcast I read true stories of people's encounters with the strange and unexplained. No comedy, skepticism, or gore, only 100% true spooky tales. First, a thank you to the new Patreon subscriber, Catherine. Thank you so much for joining the Ghouls and Ghosts Social Club and for keeping the podcast going. And before we get into today's story, I wanted to share something special. I was recently interviewed by Jen Vasquez for Vamp Jen's Corner. Jen is a writer and an avid reader with a deep love for all things eerie and elegant. She was classically trained in voice and once dreamed of becoming an opera singer, which I think is just so fitting for someone who's as fascinated by vampires, the macabre, and vintage Hollywood as I am. Her website dives into events, people, and topics that celebrate everything beautifully odd and spooky. If you love hearing about behind the scenes of spooky storytelling, definitely check out the interview and her blog at jenvasquez.com, which I've also linked in the show notes. As I've mentioned many times on the podcast, I was a spooky kid, obsessed with all things horror and supernatural that I could get my hands on. Luckily, my sisters were the same, so we frequently swapped Christopher Pike books with one another or watched TV shows that promised to scare us. One of these shows was Beyond Belief, Fact or Fiction, which premiered on Fox in 1997. In the second season, I watched an episode that traumatized me for decades. A young boy named Danny is bullied by his schoolmates and his older brother Brian, and Danny would frequently tell his mother about a monster in his closet. This culminates into his older brother and friends threatening to lock Danny in the closet, and when the brother goes into the closet to pretend to be scared of the monster and mock Danny, you see the door close behind him, and you hear his screams and pleas to be let out. Only for his mother to open the closet and file a pile of Brian's clothes, and nothing else. I later found out this was a great exaggeration, the true story being that the young boy had hidden access to his attic through a ceiling tile and actually ran away. But for 10-year-old me, it was simply proof that closets were portals to the unknown and not to be messed with. If you're interested in watching the episode, I've added the link in the show notes. But long before this episode, closets have been common tropes in horror stories. The dark enclosed space, the creak of a door opening, a shadow that seems darker than the surrounding atmosphere. A slow, open closet door in a dark room seems to trigger our basest instincts. In this episode, I'll be reading true stories of people who encountered the strange and unexplained in their closets. As always, I would love to hear your stories. But in the meantime, turn down the lights, get comfortable, and listen in. The Unknown Ghost, submitted by user Mama Helium. I grew up with a ghost, but I never told anyone until I was an adult. And it turns out I wasn't the only one who knew about it. My grandparents' house was built in late 1905 just outside of Boston and was owned briefly by an Irish family who used the attic to house recent immigrant families until they found their own places. Then, my great-grandparents bought it in 1919, raised my grandmother and her sisters, and my grandparents bought it from her parents and raised my dad. All this to say, a long family history in that house, but also a long history of many comings and goings. My great-grandfather and great-grandmother also both died there in the back room off the kitchen. Growing up, my brother and I often spent weekends there while my folks were out on the town. We loved it there for the most part because we got to watch a lot of TV and eat junk food. But I remember always being nervous around bedtime. I stayed in my dad's old room, and when the lights went out, I knew the same thing was coming. Something would come out of the closet. It didn't matter whether the door was closed or not, and it would stand over my bed. I could hear the footsteps, and I could sense them in the dark, but I couldn't see them. Sometimes I would hear what sounded like a rubber ball being bounced either in the room with me or upstairs in the attic. And even as young as I was, I knew this wasn't something my conservative Catholic grandparents were going to respond well to. So I just made it a habit to sleep with the covers over my head and try to tune it out. I never slept well there, but over the years, assumed I was just creeped out because it was an old house. Cut to many years later. Both my grandparents had passed, and my brother rented the house from my uncle. He asked my partner and I to come over a few days into living there because he said he didn't like being there alone. It was only then that I learned he had similar experiences growing up. He used to stay in my uncle's old room and would sense someone in his room watching him. Sometimes pacing near the bed, but never interacting. We were both blown away that we had grown up with these experiences that we chalked up to our imagination. He felt overwhelmed, so he went out for a cigarette with my partner. I stayed in and grabbed a beer to settle my nerves. Then I heard what sounded like something heavy and wooden scraping something. It lasted probably 15 to 20 seconds, then stopped. I asked my brother when he came back in, and he told me that's part of why he asked us to come over. The old wooden dresser that was in the master bedroom kept sliding back to the same spot under the window, no matter where he put it in the room. When he was out of the room or out of the house, this would happen. My partner, being both handy and skeptical, investigated the slant of the floor and any wear patterns, but while it's certainly a bit of a wonky old floor, nothing would explain it moving up to 5 feet from various spots in the room. We decided that that's where the dresser belongs, and he left it there. My brother moved out a few years later, and over the years he made peace with whoever was left behind there, but it was always crowded as he put his time living there. Grandma's Closet. Submitted by user Resh. I was separated from my husband for a year so we could figure out what we wanted from our marriage. And while we lived that, I lived at my mom's condo with her, my brother, who never seemed to grow up, and my then 2-year-old son and 7-year-old daughter. It was a 3-bedroom condo overlooking the ocean. The upstairs had the living space and was bright and sunny. On the bottom floor was where the 3 bedrooms were. I had my toddler son stay in the guest room while my daughter and I slept in my mother's bedroom, and my mother slept on the couch upstairs in the family room. I mentioned that the upstairs was bright and sunny with sweeping views of the ocean. The downstairs, where the bedrooms were, is another story. In the spare room where my son slept was a laundry area. It just seemed that light got absorbed there. No matter how many lights you had on or if windows were open, light just wouldn't reflect in that corner of the house. Sometimes when I would stand at the washing machines doing laundry, I could feel something with so much hate standing behind me. It felt overwhelming. I once turned to the corner where the energy was coming from and I gave it the finger. "I don't even know you," I said at seemingly nothing. I never told my mother or anyone else about this because she'd think I was nuts, and I thought maybe I was. One evening, I was cooking dinner in the upstairs kitchen and told my daughter to go downstairs to get her brother so we could have dinner. She went down the steps and down the hall, then she ran back up the stairs and announced, "I won't go downstairs alone. There's a monster there." My mother glanced at me, and I felt as if I was being tested as a mother to be firm and make my child obey me. So I told her to go back down there and get her brother. She grabbed my hand and pulled me and asked me to come with her. I pulled my arm back and told her no. I was cooking and she needed to listen to me. "There are no monsters. Go back down there and get him." She grabbed my hand as she pulled me along the staircase, this time with tears in her eyes. "Please, Mom, I'm serious. There's a monster downstairs. I'm scared." Again, I told her, "There are no monsters." I went down the stairs halfway and yelled at her to go get her brother and do it right. She ran very quickly past the washing machines into her brother's room and then ran back very fast up the stairs. And from that moment on, she never went down there alone. There was a bathroom in the laundry area where the kids would take their bath, but my daughter would only get in if there was someone there to watch. If I left for any reason, she would get out and follow me. Soon, she wouldn't sleep in my mother's bedroom unless I was there with her. I thought it was odd, but, kids, they get creeped out easily, I guess. But she never was downstairs alone again. A year later, we moved out to our own apartment, and my husband and I had since reconciled. When I was making French toast for dinner, I remembered my daughter's strange behavior at my mom's condo, so I asked her, "Hey, do you remember when we were at Grandma's condo and you said you saw a monster?" My daughter said, "Uh-huh." I continued, "You were just trying to scare Mommy, huh?" I smiled at her. "No, Mommy, I was serious. There was a monster downstairs." "Okay, well, what did you see?" She says, very plainly, "In the corner by the washing machines." I stopped and I looked at her, because she has my attention now. "What did it look like?" Very calmly, while eating dinner, she says, "She was a lady. She had long black hair and a scary, wrinkly face and burnt-up arms." "Did she do anything?" I asked. "Yeah, she moved her finger towards me with a, come here. Then I ran upstairs to tell you." "Was that the only time you ever saw her?" "No, she lives in Grandma's closet. Once I was in bed waiting for you, and I had my eyes closed, and then when I opened them, she opened the closet door, and she was almost right on top of me, looking down at me. I asked her, 'What do you want? Why don't you leave me alone?' And she said, 'You're gonna die in this house.'" My daughter turned to me with worry and said, "Mommy, is that true? Am I gonna die at Grandma's house?" "No," I said emphatically. "She said that to scare you." I realized then that she had some gifts, and it was time to teach her how to pray and visualize protection, because I knew that this wouldn't be her last experience. She saw the monster other times when we would visit my mother, and I told my mom what she saw, but she just shrugged her shoulders. I guess she didn't believe me. My brother, who also lived there, told us that there was a demon-looking figure on the ceiling watching him as he laid in his own bed. A few years later, my mom sold the condo and moved to Arizona, and I wonder if the monster witch is still in the closet. The Boy in the Closet, submitted by user Lao Wings. I'm not a superstitious man at all, and this is the only story that I cannot explain. I was spending Christmas with a mate's family at their holiday home, which was in the middle of nowhere in the bush, Australia. There were about 10 of us, and 2 of the uncles would be turning up the next day. Anyway, the place that we were staying in was old. I'm talking at least 150 years old. And in one of the bedrooms was this old closet-type thing. Think of the wardrobe from Beauty and the Beast. And that was the room that the youngest kid was going to be staying in because it had a single bed. The youngest was about 5 years old and was the son of one of the uncles. I was walking around the house when I heard the kid talking to someone in the room. I thought that someone was there, so I walked in and said, "Hey, who are you talking to?" And the kid replied, "Charlie. He lives in the closet. He's my friend and we're going to play later." Naturally, I thought it was just him playing around and making up an imaginary friend. So the next day, when we were having lunch and the uncles turned up, I said to him to tell his father about his friend. When the kid said, "Oh, that's just Charlie, we're going to play later," the father grabbed his arm and said in a panicked tone, "Where's Charlie and what does he look like?" The kid responded, "He lives in the closet in my room and he has a long coat." Both the uncles jumped up, ran into the room, and dragged the closet outside, and then set it on fire. We all then left really quickly, and I asked them both what the hell had just happened, and they said, "When we were boys, we used to play with an imaginary friend named Charlie as well, who lived in the closet. He was always trying to get us to come play with him in the bush away from the house. So whatever it was that happened, It was enough to scare two grown men when one of their sons mentioned an imaginary friend with the same name who lived in the closet. The Eyes, submitted by user Angel V. When I was about 7 or 8 years old, I lived in Anchorage, Alaska. I don't know what time of the night it was or why I woke up in the first place, but I was soundly asleep when I just opened my eyes to the dark room. I sat up on the bed and looked around the room. What I saw? I've never been able to explain, but it was greenish, glowing objects on the floor. Just random objects, bottles, fabric, and stuff. I'm looking towards the floor with a panicky feeling. My heart's pounding like crazy. When I decided to look towards the open, pitch-black closet, and I see these eyes. Not red, nor any other color, just normal eyes, which I was able to see somehow in a pitch-black room. And they were filled with so much hate. I panicked. I tried to scream, but I couldn't. I tried to call my grandmother, but nothing would come out of my mouth. It was as if something was covering my mouth. I lied back down, covered my face with my blanket, and tried counting to 3 to scream, but I couldn't. Until at one point I was able to call my grandmother, a Christian woman, who came into my room. I told her what happened, she prayed, and never again did that happen to me. The Entity in the Closet, submitted by user Disco Inferno. Back in my university days, I was accepted into a summer program in a town several hours away from my hometown. The program found housing for all of the non-local students among members of the community, which predictably put us in some pretty hit-or-miss living situations. That first summer, mine was definitely a miss. They placed me with a woman who was just weird. Very, very weird. I could fill in an entire post with examples, but suffice to say, the furnished room I was assigned had been her teenage son room before he decided he couldn't take living with her and her many ridiculous rules and quirks and moved in with his dad. In the room, there was a long sofa with a mirror above it across from a single bed, with the most comfortable mattress I have ever experienced in my life. It was like sleeping on an actual cloud and was literally the only thing about my entire stay that I wish I could recapture. Against the wall under the window and about 1.5 feet away from the bed was a very long, shallow closet from which the son had removed the doors, so it was wide open to the room. Very Spartan, very typical teenage boy. But from the moment I moved in, I got the sensation that the room wasn't quite as empty as it looked. And there was something in the closet. Something that could move back and forth within the closet. Something that was always watching me. Not malevolent necessarily, but not welcoming either. I did my best to ignore it, and when I couldn't ignore it completely, I fell back on my usual tactic and sang musical theater songs to myself to buck up my courage and in the hopes of placating whatever it was. I felt we had reached a truce of some kind, if an uneasy one, and I was happy to tell myself that it was probably all my imagination anyway, or the psychological effects of something catching a strange reflection of light from the window, or a glimpse of my own movements in the mirror, or something normal, something logical. At any rate, I did not talk about the thing in my closet at all to anyone. Until one night, another student got left behind by his ride. Our department was always the last to finish, and I was the only person who lived within walking distance, So, despite my weirdo landlady's insistence that I wasn't supposed to have any visitors even cross the threshold of the front door, I said he could crash on my sofa in my room. So I sneaked him in, got him situated on the sofa, and we settled down to sleep. Everything was silent for a bit. And then my friend said, "Are you awake?" And I said, "Yeah." And my friend said, "It feels like there's something in the closet." I asked what he meant, and they said, "I don't know, it just feels like there's someone in there watching us, looking out. Don't you feel that?" I said nope and wished them a good night. When we got to campus the next day, I told them the truth, that I had always had that feeling that there was some kind of entity lurking in the closet watching me, but that I was entirely unwilling to outright acknowledge it in its presence, so to speak, in case that was asking for trouble. But I could not believe he had felt it too. And maybe it wasn't just my imagination after all. After that, we would sometimes joke about the entity in the closet, but I never felt wholly comfortable about it, and eventually I stopped spending the night at that place entirely. It wasn't really that bad, just spooky and not relaxing at all, to always feel like it was on display. Grandma's Creepy Closet, submitted by user Mikey85. Growing up, my grandma lived in the apartment upstairs in the same complex where my family and I lived. It was an old building with only 12 apartments in total. She resided in apartment 2874, while we lived in 2868. Since before I was born, Grandma had been living alone. However, she had this closet in her hallway leading to her bedroom that seemed to have a strange occurrence every month. Once a month, Grandma would ask my mom to come upstairs and help her check her closet. She claimed that the night before she could hear a lot of noise coming from the closet. One day, my mom was busy and asked me to go in her place. Little did I know that this would be the start of a series of strange and unsettling experiences. As I entered Grandma's apartment and made my way to her closet, I was taken aback by the sight before me. It looked as if someone had ransacked the whole closet. Her clothes were upside down, the boxes were open, and the contents were scattered across the floor. It was as if a tornado had swept through Grandma's closet, but left the rest of the apartment untouched. I asked Grandma if this happened every month, and she confirmed that it had been occurring for the past 20 years. At the time, I didn't pay much attention to it and simply tidied up the closet before continuing with the day. However, around 2 years later, my mom suddenly passed away. In an effort to save money and have some support, Grandma decided to move in with my dad and me. We were in the process of moving when my dad asked me to retrieve some papers he had upstairs in Grandma's bedroom. Reluctantly, I made my way to her apartment, feeling a sense of unease in the air. When I walked past the closet, I could hear loud banging noises, as if someone was desperately trying to break out from the inside. Trying not to think too much about it, I brushed it off and continued towards the bedroom. However, as soon as I stepped inside, the bedroom door slammed shut, trapping me in. Panic set in as I struggled to open the door, only to find that it was being held shut from the other side. Luckily, I managed to force the door open and I ran out of the apartment as fast as I could. As I fled past the closet, I noticed that the banging had intensified and the whole structure was shaking violently, as though it was on the brink of exploding. Completely terrified, I made it back to my own room, tossing the keys to Grandma's apartment to my dad, and exclaimed, "Forget that, you go get it." The strange occurrences in Grandma's closet had escalated to a point where I didn't want any part in it. From that day forward, we never mentioned the incident again, and my dad took on the task of retrieving any belongings from Grandma's apartment. We moved on with our lives, trying to forget about the unsettling experiences we encountered, and to this day, I still wonder what caused those disturbances, and if there was something more sinister at play. Mom's Test, submitted by user Lauren Bell. I grew up in the suburbs of a mid-sized Australian town, in a fairly large house with a long hallway. At the end of the hallway, my room was to the left and my parents' bedroom was directly opposite to the right. Due to my fear of dark, I slept with my bedroom door open, and my parents did the same so they could hear me if I got up at night. My mom told me she once woke to hear me giggling and carrying out one side of a full conversation in the middle of the night. Slightly spooked, she called out from her room to ask who I was talking to. I told her not to worry, that it was just the old lady in my room who looked after me sometimes. From that point on, she noticed I would often have these lively conversations with someone who just wasn't there. I was an imaginative and bossy child, so she chalked it up to that. But my bedroom always made her feel uneasy. In particular, her unease was directed towards the row of built-in cupboards along the right wall of the room. There were 3 doors of empty hanging space plus a 4th door of enclosed shelves, and the latch mechanism was a little metal bar that slid between the 2 rollers. One of the closet doors would always be slightly ajar. Mom would put laundry away, close all the doors, then return 5 minutes later to find one had been popped open. She is a no-nonsense Dutch woman and fastidious about everything being in its place, so this was driving her nuts. She tried closing all the doors and standing in front, waiting for one to open, but it never did in her presence. She thought perhaps it was an air pressure thing, that the pressure inside the cupboard was enough to pop a door open. One day, while she had the house to herself, she decided to test her theory. She climbed inside the cupboard and shut all the doors on herself. As she tells it, after a few seconds, a feeling of absolute dread came over her. She's not claustrophobic in the slightest. She was a scuba instructor who loved underwater caves. But in that closet, she said she could feel an oppressive presence. Sufficiently freaked out, she pushed on the door to get out, and it wouldn't budge. She slammed against the door again and again, trying to get out. She thought my father had come home and was leaning against the door to mess with her, so she screamed his name and told him to knock it off. Then, just like that, the presence disappeared, and pop, the door at the other end of the closet opened. She climbed out, tested the doors, but they all opened and closed fine, and nobody else was home. Dr. Ninni's house, submitted by user Hailzor. When I was little, my maternal grandparents lived in an old house by the side of County Road 1 in a rural Appalachian town in southern Ohio. The house had been previously owned by a doctor, Dr. Ninni, and he used it as his home doctor's office from the 1940s to the 1970s. It was a nice big house, and as a kid, I loved it because it had an in-ground trampoline, swimming pool, and this cool little fish pond out front with all these little structures, like a little clock tower structure and a small bridge that crossed over the pond. Just there for the aesthetic, but perfectly sized for 5-year-old me to play on. My mom is the youngest of 6, and Mama and Papa's house was where we'd spend every holiday and birthday and Sunday dinner with all the cousins. My grandparents didn't know the house was haunted when they moved in, but they quickly found out. My mom was still a teenager when they first moved in and had always told us stories about the creepy things that would happen to her. Doors slamming, rooms going cold, figures showing up. I have a million, but I'll just stick to the things that I remember. My cousins and I always hated the basement. It was a really weird setup, cold and concrete and brick walls, and it was connected by a huge entryway to another room that was almost like a garage. Apparently, that's where cars would unload patients who were in particularly dire need of help and couldn't make it up the stairs to the front door. Or where the hearse would pick up the bodies, if Dr. Ninni couldn't save them. Also, that's where my mama stored old furniture they weren't currently using, and it was all covered in white sheets. Anyway, in the summers, after we'd play outside all day and swim, we'd always have to come in through the basement to take off our dirty clothes or wet swimsuits before coming up into the main part of the house. When I was little, we'd fight over who would be the last one to go up the stairs because the only light switch was at the bottom, and you'd have to walk up those creaky steps in the dark. And every time, if you were the last one up the stairs, you'd hear the creak of your step and then the one behind you, as if someone was following you up. The second occurrence was once we were all playing hide and seek. This house was really huge, with a million great little rooms and closets and cupboards and pantries, so a game could seriously last hours when all the cousins were there. I was still only about 5 or 6, so not the best hider. I had chosen a closet and hid down behind a bunch of clothes. I remember in the dark a rush of light, as if someone opened the closet door, then closed it behind them. I could feel someone in there with me, hear their breath, but I assumed it was just one of my cousins. I was actually a little peeved, and I remember whispering, "I was here first, don't get me caught." Minutes ticked by, and finally, I was found, alone in the closet. Eventually, my grandparents moved, but it's still my favorite thing when we all get together for the holidays and inevitably start telling the stories of our creepiest encounters with the spirits in Dr. Ninni's house. And that's all for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories, and I'd love to hear what your ghost in the closet experience is. So if you have one, make sure to email me at chillersandthrillers@gmail.com. Next episode is our Halloween special. I have some really great scary stories lined up for that, so I hope you'll join me then. And if you want to hear any more stories, make sure to check out the Patreon for bonus episodes. In the meantime, I hope all you ghouls and ghosts stay safe. And if you're listening to the end and you're on Spotify or YouTube, let me know what you're planning on dressing up for as Halloween. I'll see you all next time.